There are moments in life when heaven begins to move, and yet earth is tempted to speak. Moments when God stretches out his hand, and humanity feels the urgency to explain, to question, to interfere. But beloved, not every divine movement requires a human response. Some moments demand reverence, not reaction. Some moments demand silence, not speech. When God moves, it is not hurried. It is not noisy. It is not confused. God moves with purpose, with precision, with eternal wisdom. And when he begins his work, he is not asking for our commentary, he is inviting our trust. Silence before God is not weakness, it is faith at its highest level. It is the language of those who know that God is at work, even when nothing seems to be happening. Too often, we mistake activity for obedience. We think we must do something, say something, prove something. But there are seasons when God says, "Be still." Not because he is absent, but because he is present. Not because he is delayed, but because he is preparing. In those sacred moments, silence becomes a sanctuary where faith matures and the Spirit aligns with heaven. God's greatest miracles are often conceived in quiet places, before the announcement, before the breakthrough, before the testimony. When the world sees nothing, God is forming everything. And if we speak too soon, if we act too quickly, we may disturb what God is carefully shaping. This is your moment, not to strive, not to panic, not to explain, but to trust, to stand in awe, to remain still. Because when God moves, he does not need assistance, he needs surrender. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a believer can do is to stay silent and let God be God. When we say that God moves sovereignly, often beyond human explanation, we are acknowledging a reality that stands at the center of genuine faith. God is not governed by human logic, emotional urgency, or visible evidence. His movement does not originate from circumstance, pressure, or demand. It flows from his own will, wisdom, and authority. Sovereignty means he acts because he chooses to act, not because conditions are favorable, not because people are ready, and not because the moment appears reasonable to the human mind. This truth immediately confronts one of the deepest struggles within the human heart, the desire to understand before trusting. Humanity longs to explain, define, and predict, yet divine movement frequently unfolds in ways that resist explanation, challenge expectations, and unsettle comfort. When God moves, he does not always announce his intentions. He does not submit his plans for human approval or clarification. Often, his work begins quietly, invisibly, and in contradiction to what people assume should happen. This is why many miss the moment of divine movement, not because God is absent, but because they are looking for noise, signs, or familiar patterns. Sovereign movement is not theatrical by nature, it is authoritative. It does not need validation. It does not depend on recognition. It simply is. Faith matures when one learns to recognize that God may be most active precisely when circumstances appear unchanged, confusing, or even regressive. Human reasoning seeks linear progress, cause, effect, result. Divine sovereignty is not bound to such sequences. God may delay when urgency seems necessary, or he may accelerate when preparation appears incomplete. He may close doors that seem aligned with logic and open paths that appear impossible. This is not randomness, it is governance at a level higher than human comprehension. To accept that God moves beyond explanation is not to abandon reason, but to acknowledge its limits. Faith does not eliminate thinking, it places thinking under trust. One of the most difficult disciplines in spiritual life is resisting the urge to interfere with what cannot yet be understood. When God moves sovereignly, there is often tension between what is seen and what is promised, between what is felt and what is believed. In these moments, people are tempted to fill the silence with interpretation, fear, or premature action. Yet sovereignty means God is not asking for assistance. He is not dependent on human intervention to complete divine intention. Interference, even when well-meaning, can be rooted in insecurity rather than faith. Silence becomes essential because it restrains the impulse to control what was never entrusted to human hands. Divine sovereignty also dismantles pride. Explanation gives a sense of mastery, and mastery feeds the illusion of control. When something cannot be explained, the ego feels threatened. God's movement beyond explanation humbles the mind and recenters the heart. It reminds humanity that faith is not built on comprehension, but on relationship. Trust grows not because everything makes sense, but because God is consistent even when circumstances are not. Sovereignty assures that nothing unfolds accidentally, even when meaning is not immediately visible. There is also a refining work that occurs when God moves without explanation. The absence of clarity tests motive. Are we faithful only when outcomes are predictable? Or can we remain surrendered when direction is hidden? True trust is revealed not in moments of understanding, but in moments of ambiguity. When God withholds explanation, He is not withholding care. He is often deepening dependence. He is teaching the heart to lean not on insight, but on intimacy. In sovereign movement, timing plays a critical role. Human impatience demands immediate answers, but God's timing operates within eternity, not urgency. What feels delayed may actually be protected. What appears inactive may be in precise alignment. God's sovereignty ensures that no movement is premature and no silence is wasted. Every pause has purpose, every delay has design, and every unseen process is moving toward fulfillment even when the surface remains unchanged. This is why silence becomes a posture of wisdom when God moves. Silence does not mean passivity, it means alignment. It is an acknowledgement that speaking too soon may distort perception, and acting too quickly may disrupt divine order. Silence allows space for discernment rather than assumption. It honors the reality that God may be accomplishing more than can be articulated. In silence, faith listens rather than explains, waits rather than rushes, and rests rather than strives. Understanding sovereignty also guards against discouragement. When events unfold in ways that defy expectation, those who believe God must always explain Himself are easily shaken. But those who trust His sovereignty remain steady. They understand that confusion does not indicate failure, and lack of clarity does not imply absence. God can be fully present and actively working even when the human mind feels lost. This confidence does not come from answers, but from assurance that God's authority is intact regardless of appearance. Ultimately, acknowledging that God moves beyond explanation invites surrender at the deepest level. It calls the heart to release the demand for certainty and embrace trust as an act of worship. It shifts faith from dependency on outcomes to dependency on God Himself. In this place, silence is no longer uncomfortable. It becomes sacred. The need to explain fades, the need to control loosens, and the soul learns to stand still. Not because everything is understood, but because God is trusted, even when understanding has not yet arrived, even when clarity is postponed, even when the path remains unseen, and the only assurance is that divine sovereignty is already at work, moving with precision, purpose, and authority beyond what words can capture or logic can define. Silence is sometimes the highest form of faith, because faith is not always proven by words, declarations, or visible action. There are moments when faith speaks boldly, and there are moments when faith bows deeply. Silence belongs to the latter. It is the posture of a heart that trusts God enough to stop explaining, stop defending, and stop striving. In a world that rewards noise, urgency, and constant expression, silence appears weak or passive, yet spiritually it can be the most powerful response. Silence before God is not emptiness, it is fullness restrained. It is confidence that does not need to announce itself. Human nature is uncomfortable with silence because silence removes control. Words give the illusion of influence, as though speaking can shape outcomes or accelerate results. When things feel uncertain, people talk more, analyze more, pray louder, explain deeper, hoping clarity will emerge from activity. But faith at its highest level understands that God is not moved by volume or repetition. Silence becomes an act of surrender, a declaration that God is already aware, already present, and already working. It is the decision to trust God without managing Him. Silence also reveals the difference between faith and anxiety. Anxiety speaks constantly because it fears being ignored. Faith can remain silent because it knows it is seen. When silence is rooted in faith, it is not avoidance, it is assurance. It says, I do not need to panic because God is not confused. Silence allows the soul to rest in the truth that divine awareness exceeds human concern. In that stillness, faith matures, no longer dependent on emotional reassurance or immediate feedback. There is a sacred discipline in learning when not to speak. Silence requires discernment because not all quietness is faith and not all speech is unbelief. But when God is moving, silence becomes alignment. Speaking too quickly can come from fear of delay, fear of loss, or fear of being forgotten. Faith understands that what God has begun does not need constant supervision. Silence honors the process. It acknowledges that God's work does not require commentary to continue unfolding. Silence also protects the work of God within a person. Some transformations are fragile in their early stages. Words can expose what is not yet ready, and exposure can invite doubt, interference, or discouragement. Faith sometimes remains silent, not because it is unsure, but because it is guarding something sacred. Silence becomes a shelter where trust grows without pressure. It allows God to shape character before outcomes are revealed. In silence, the heart learns dependence rather than performance. Speaking can become a way to prove faith, to convince others, or even to convince oneself. Silence removes the audience. It strips faith of performance and leaves only relationship. When no one hears the declaration, faith still stands. When no one affirms the belief, trust remains. This kind of faith does not seek validation, it rests in conviction. Silence also trains the soul to listen. Faith is not only believing, it is receiving. Constant speech can drown out discernment. When the heart is quiet, it becomes sensitive to direction, correction, and reassurance that cannot be heard in noise. Silence sharpens spiritual awareness. It creates space for understanding that does not come through logic, but through inner certainty. This listening posture is essential when God is guiding through subtle shifts rather than dramatic signs. Choosing silence requires humility. Words often arise from the desire to control narratives, outcomes, or perceptions. Silence relinquishes that control. It allows God to define the moment rather than human explanation. Humility trusts that God's interpretation is greater than any personal understanding. Silence says, I do not need to be right. I need to be faithful. This humility anchors the heart when circumstances are misunderstood or misjudged by others. Silence also strengthens endurance. Faith that depends on constant expression can become exhausted. Silence conserves spiritual strength. It allows faith to breathe, to remain steady without burning out. In quiet trust, the soul learns perseverance without agitation. Silence sustains faith over long seasons when nothing appears to change. It teaches the heart to remain settled even when answers are delayed. There is also courage in silence. It takes courage not to react, not to explain, not to defend when misunderstood. Faith-filled silence resists the urge to justify itself. It trusts that truth does not need constant reinforcement. This courage is not indifference, it is restraint. It chooses peace over argument and trust over proof. Such silence reflects confidence in God's ability to bring clarity in His time. Silence becomes especially powerful when expectations are high and outcomes are uncertain. In those moments, words can betray fear even when faith is intended. Silence allows faith to remain pure, unpolluted by speculation or doubt. It creates a space where hope can exist without pressure. Silence does not deny reality, it places reality under trust. Ultimately, silence as faith is an expression of deep security in God's character. It believes that God hears without being reminded, sees without being informed, and acts without being instructed. Silence says that God's presence is enough, even when His plan is not yet visible. It is faith that does not rush God, faith that does not compete with time, faith that does not demand explanations before obedience. In this silence, trust becomes steady, the heart becomes still, and faith stands firm, without noise, without proof, without urgency, resting fully in the certainty that God is at work even now, even here, even in the quiet, even in the waiting, even when nothing is said and everything is entrusted to Him. God's greatest works are birthed in unseen moments because divine activity does not depend on human visibility to be powerful. What is most transformative often begins where there is no applause, no recognition, and no immediate evidence. The human mind associates importance with visibility, assuming that what is hidden is insignificant and what is unseen is inactive. Yet the deepest work of God frequently unfolds beyond observation, beneath the surface of circumstances, in places where no one is watching and nothing appears to be changing. This reality challenges the natural desire to measure progress by what can be seen, tracked, or explained. Unseen moments are uncomfortable because they strip away reassurance. When nothing appears to be happening, doubt finds room to speak. The heart begins to question whether God is truly working or whether nothing is happening at all. But unseen does not mean undone. In the unseen, God is forming foundations strong enough to sustain what will later be revealed. Visibility without preparation leads to collapse, but hidden preparation produces endurance. What God builds in secret carries the weight of what will one day be revealed in public. The unseen is where transformation begins, because true change always starts internally before it becomes external. Growth that is rushed into visibility without depth becomes fragile. God often works quietly to shape character, refine motives, and align the heart before altering circumstances. The unseen season is where faith is tested not by opposition, but by silence. It is easy to believe when results are visible. It is far more demanding to trust when progress cannot be measured. Yet it is precisely in these seasons that faith becomes authentic rather than reactive. There is a divine wisdom in concealment. If everything God was doing were immediately visible, faith would be unnecessary. Trust would be replaced by evidence, and reliance on God would be replaced by confidence in outcomes. By working in unseen moments, God invites the heart to lean into relationship rather than results. The unseen cultivates intimacy because it requires dependence without guarantees. It teaches the soul to remain faithful without reward and obedient without explanation. Unseen moments are also protective. Exposure too early can attract pressure that destroys what is still forming. God hides what He values until it is ready to stand without being damaged by scrutiny, expectation, or misunderstanding. Many things fail not because they are wrong, but because they are revealed too soon. In the unseen, growth is allowed to be imperfect, incomplete, and vulnerable. God nurtures without rushing, strengthens without display, and matures without interruption. Human impatience often interprets unseen seasons as delay or denial. But divine timing is not inactivity. What appears dormant may be deeply active beneath the surface. Just as roots grow unseen before a tree bears fruit, God's work often begins where no one can observe it. Without deep roots, visible fruit cannot last. God prioritizes depth over speed, substance over spectacle. The unseen is where endurance is formed, where stability is established, and where lasting strength is developed. Unseen moments also expose the true source of motivation. When no one is watching, when progress is not visible, when affirmation is absent, the heart is revealed. Is faith driven by love or by recognition? Is obedience sustained by trust or by reward? God uses unseen seasons to purify intention, stripping away performance and leaving sincerity. What survives in the unseen is genuine. What requires attention to continue is often shallow. The unseen also teaches patience, one of the most difficult yet essential virtues. Waiting without evidence stretches the soul. It forces the heart to release control and surrender timelines. In these moments, faith learns to rest rather than strive. Patience is not passive, it is active trust. It believes that God's silence is not neglect and His invisibility is not absence. The unseen becomes a classroom where endurance is learned and resilience is strengthened. There is also a refining of perception that occurs in unseen seasons. When external cues are removed, the heart becomes more sensitive to internal guidance. Without constant noise, discernment sharpens. The unseen quiets distractions and refines focus. It teaches the heart to recognize God, not through dramatic signs, but through steady assurance. This sensitivity becomes essential later, when visible success could otherwise drown out inner conviction. Unseen moments prepare a person to handle what will eventually be seen. Visibility brings pressure, expectation, and responsibility. Without unseen formation, visibility becomes dangerous. God's greatest works are not only about what is accomplished, but about who is able to carry the weight of that accomplishment without being undone by it. The unseen builds capacity. It strengthens integrity. It grounds identity so that when recognition comes, it does not replace dependence on God. The unseen also reframes success. Instead of measuring progress by external milestones, faith learns to value obedience, consistency, and trust. The unseen teaches that success is not always immediate change, but faithful endurance. It shifts focus from outcomes to alignment. In doing so, it frees the heart from anxiety and comparison. What God is doing in secret does not need to compete with what others display publicly. When God chooses to reveal what was formed in the unseen, its impact carries weight and authority. What emerges has substance because it was not rushed. It has stability because it was tested without support. It has authenticity because it was not shaped by audience approval. The unseen gives birth to works that endure because they were formed under the careful, patient hand of God rather than the pressure of expectation. Ultimately, unseen moments redefine trust. They teach that God is most faithful when He is least visible. They train the heart to remain anchored when evidence is absent and to remain confident when progress cannot be explained. In these moments, faith is no longer dependent on signs, timelines, or outcomes. It becomes rooted in the character of God Himself, trusting that what is hidden is not wasted, what is quiet is not inactive, and what is unseen is often where the greatest work is already unfolding, even now, beyond perception, beyond explanation, beyond what the eyes can see and the mind can measure. Human words can interrupt divine processes because words are not neutral. They carry intention, emotion, timing, and often impatience. When God is at work, especially in ways that are subtle, forming, or still unfolding, premature speech can interfere with what requires space, trust, and time. Speaking is often driven by the need to explain what is not yet clear, to reduce discomfort, or to regain a sense of control. Yet divine processes do not respond to pressure, commentary, or urgency. They respond to alignment. When words arise from fear, doubt, or the desire to manage outcomes, they can disrupt the posture of surrender that divine movement requires. Words shape perception. When a person speaks too soon about what God is doing, they often frame it through limited understanding. This framing can confine expectation, placing boundaries around something that has not yet reached its full form. Divine processes are fluid, unfolding layer by layer. When language attempts to define them prematurely, it can narrow vision and create assumptions that later become obstacles. What God intended to grow freely can become constrained by human interpretation spoken aloud before maturity has occurred. Speech also has the power to externalize what should remain internal for a season. Some works of God are meant to be carried quietly, not because they are uncertain, but because they are sacred. Words expose. Exposure invites opinions, scrutiny, and influence. Not all influence is healthy, even when it appears supportive. When divine processes are still forming, external voices can introduce doubt, comparison, or pressure that disrupts internal conviction. Silence protects what words might weaken. There is also a tendency for words to accelerate timelines. When people speak about what God is doing, they often attach expectations to timing, even unintentionally. Statements create anticipation, and anticipation creates pressure. Pressure tempts action before readiness. Divine processes unfold according to precision, not popularity. When words rush the process, they can lead to decisions made to satisfy expectation rather than obedience. God's work does not require deadlines imposed by speech. Words can also redirect focus from God to self. Talking about divine movement can subtly shift attention toward personal involvement, interpretation, or role. The process becomes something to manage rather than something to trust. Silence keeps the focus where it belongs. It allows God to remain central rather than becoming a subject of analysis. When words dominate, reverence can diminish. Silence preserves awe, and awe sustains humility. Speech often arises from the desire to resolve tension. Uncertainty creates discomfort, and words seem to offer relief. Yet many divine processes require unresolved tension to accomplish their purpose. Growth often happens in spaces where answers are incomplete. Speaking too soon can prematurely resolve what God intends to stretch. Stretching strengthens faith, resolution too early can weaken it. Silence allows the tension to do its work. There is also a difference between faith-filled speech and reactionary speech. Faith-filled speech aligns with timing, discernment, and purpose. Reactionary speech arises from emotion, fear, or impatience. When God is moving, emotions are often heightened. Excitement, anxiety, hope, and uncertainty coexist. Without restraint, speech in these moments can reflect emotion rather than faith. Words spoken from emotion can contradict trust, even when intentions are sincere. Silence allows emotions to settle, so that when speech does come, growth often happens in spaces where answers are incomplete. Speaking too soon can prematurely resolve what God intends to stretch. Stretching strengthens faith, resolution too early can weaken it. Silence allows the tension to do its work. There is also a difference between faith-filled speech and reactionary speech. Faith-filled speech aligns with timing, discernment, and purpose. Reactionary speech arises from emotion, fear, or impatience. When God is moving, emotions are often heightened. Excitement, anxiety, hope, and uncertainty coexist. Without restraint, speech in these moments can reflect emotion rather than faith. Words spoken from emotion can contradict trust, even when intentions are sincere. Silence allows emotions to settle, so that when speech does come, it flows from conviction rather than impulse. Words can unintentionally invite resistance. Declaring what God is doing before it is complete can provoke opposition, skepticism, or misunderstanding. Not everyone will perceive divine movement with clarity or respect. Silence avoids unnecessary resistance. It allows God's work to reach a point where it stands on its own, requiring no defense. What is complete does not need explanation. What is forming often does. There is also an internal interruption that occurs through speech. Talking continuously about what God is doing can drown out inner awareness. The heart becomes occupied with expression rather than reception. Divine processes often require listening more than speaking. Silence creates room for discernment, adjustment, and deeper understanding. When words dominate, listening diminishes. What God intends to reveal internally may be missed because the focus is outward. Silence also resists the temptation to claim ownership over what belongs to God. Words can subtly suggest possession or control. Silence acknowledges that the process is not human property. It belongs to God from beginning to end. This posture preserves dependence. It prevents the heart from attaching identity to outcomes or progress. When speech is restrained, surrender remains intact. Interruption through words is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it appears as overanalysis, repeated explanations, or constant updates. These forms of speech still shift attention away from trust toward management. Divine processes thrive in faith, not supervision. Silence communicates confidence that God does not need reminders, strategies, or reinforcement. It affirms that divine wisdom exceeds human insight. There is a season for speaking, and there is a season for silence. Wisdom discerns the difference. When God is initiating, forming, or refining, silence often honors the work more than words. Speaking at the wrong time does not stop God's power, but it can complicate the journey. It can create unnecessary detours, distractions, or delays rooted not in divine will but in human interference. Silence does not mean denial or passivity. It means restraint rooted in trust. It is an active decision to step back and allow God to move without interruption. In silence, the heart aligns with divine rhythm rather than imposing its own. This alignment creates peace even when outcomes are uncertain. It allows the process to unfold without distortion. Ultimately, learning that human words can interrupt divine processes teaches humility, patience, and discernment. It trains the soul to recognize that not everything needs to be spoken, explained, or shared. Some things are meant to be carried quietly until their time of revelation arrives. In honoring silence, faith protects what God is forming and allows divine work to reach completion without interference, without pressure, without premature exposure, trusting that what God is doing does not need human narration to succeed. Faith learns to rest, not rush, because true trust is revealed not in how quickly one reacts, but in how deeply one can remain settled when movement is slow or unclear. Rushing is often mistaken for diligence, but spiritually it is frequently a sign of insecurity. When the heart rushes, it is usually attempting to outrun uncertainty, discomfort, or fear. Rest, on the other hand, reflects confidence. It signals that the soul believes God is not late, not distracted, and not dependent on human speed to fulfill what He has begun. Rest is not laziness. It is assurance expressed through stillness. The impulse to rush comes from the human desire to resolve tension. Waiting creates pressure, and pressure demands release. Action feels like progress, even when it is premature. Faith that has not yet learned to rest confuses movement with obedience and speed with effectiveness. Yet divine purpose is not accelerated by anxiety. Rushing often leads to decisions made to escape discomfort rather than to align with wisdom. Rest allows faith to mature beyond impulse into discernment. Resting faith understands timing as sacred. It recognizes that some things cannot be forced without being damaged. Growth requires pace, and formation requires patience. When faith rests, it yields control over timing and trusts that delays are not denials. Rushing assumes that sooner is better, but rest understands that readiness matters more than immediacy. What arrives too early often lacks strength, depth, or endurance. Rest also reveals a settled view of God's character. Rushing implies fear that God might forget, overlook, or fail to act. Rest declares confidence that God is attentive and intentional. It trusts that what has been promised is already held securely. Even if not yet visible, faith that rests does not constantly check for signs or updates. It knows that silence does not equal neglect, and waiting does not equal abandonment. Learning to rest requires unlearning the habit of self-dependence. Rushing often places responsibility back onto human effort, subtly shifting trust from God to personal action. Rest resists this shift. It keeps responsibility where it belongs. Resting faith acknowledges limitations without panic. It accepts that not everything can be solved, fixed, or advanced by human strength. This acceptance is not defeat, it is surrender. Rest also protects clarity. When the soul rushes, perception narrows. Decisions are made quickly but not always wisely. Fear accelerates thought but weakens discernment. Rest slows the inner pace enough to allow understanding to surface. In rest, faith sees more clearly because it is not clouded by urgency. It becomes responsive rather than reactive, intentional rather than impulsive. There is also an emotional dimension to resting faith. Rushing exhausts the spirit. Constant urgency drains strength and creates chronic tension. Rest restores. It allows faith to breathe. It sustains endurance over long seasons when nothing appears to be changing. Without rest, faith becomes brittle, easily discouraged by delays. With rest, faith becomes resilient, able to wait without losing hope. Resting faith does not disengage. It remains attentive without being anxious. It is present without being frantic. It listens without demanding immediate answers. This posture allows God's guidance to be received without distortion. When faith rushes, it often hears what it wants rather than what is true. Rest creates space for alignment rather than assumption. Rushing can also distort identity. When progress is slow, rushing faith may equate delay with failure or worth with productivity. Resting faith separates identity from outcome. It knows that value is not diminished by waiting. It understands that becoming is as important as achieving. This perspective guards against comparison and self-judgment, both of which intensify the urge to rush. Rest is also an act of humility. It acknowledges that not everything depends on human action. It accepts that God's wisdom exceeds personal understanding. Rushing assumes knowledge, rest admits mystery. Faith that rests is comfortable not knowing everything immediately. It trusts that understanding will come at the right time, and that clarity gained too early might not yet be useful. In seasons of uncertainty, resting faith becomes a witness. It demonstrates peace where anxiety would be expected. It stands steady where urgency would be normal. This rest is not indifference. It is confidence anchored in trust. It reassures the heart that waiting is not wasted time, but active alignment. Resting faith also resists the fear of missing out. Rushing often stems from the belief that if action is delayed, opportunity will be lost. Rest trusts that what is meant to arrive cannot be missed by those who remain aligned. It believes that God does not require scrambling or competition to fulfill purpose. What belongs to faith will not pass by because of patience. Learning to rest is often uncomfortable because it removes distraction. In rest, emotions surface, doubts emerge, and unresolved questions remain present. Rushing avoids these internal tensions by focusing outward. Rest faces them without panic. It allows faith to deepen rather than escape. This depth becomes strength over time. Ultimately, faith learns to rest because rest reflects a settled relationship rather than a transactional one. It trusts not because something has happened, but because of who God is. It waits not because it has no choice, but because it believes waiting is safe. Resting faith understands that rushing ahead of God can lead away from Him, while resting with God keeps the heart aligned with divine rhythm, even when the path is slow, even when answers are delayed, even when progress is unseen, and the only movement required is the quiet confidence to remain still and trust that God is already working in perfect timing. God works best when pride is absent, because pride competes with surrender, and divine movement requires openness rather than self-assertion. Pride seeks control, recognition, and certainty, while God's work flourishes in humility, trust, and dependence. When pride is present, the heart subtly positions itself as central, even in spiritual matters. Decisions become influenced by self-image, reputation, or the need to appear capable. In such a state, God's work is not easily received because pride filters everything through the lens of self. Humility, by contrast, removes the obstruction. It creates space for God to move freely without resistance, negotiation, or conditions. Pride is often misunderstood as arrogance alone, but it can appear in quieter forms such as self-reliance, defensiveness, or the need to understand everything before obeying. These expressions still place the self above trust. When pride governs the heart, faith becomes conditional. Trust is offered only when outcomes align with expectations or when understanding feels sufficient. God's work, however, often unfolds beyond explanation and outside comfort. Pride resists this because it prefers predictability and control. Humility accepts mystery without panic and uncertainty without withdrawal. When pride is absent, the heart becomes teachable. Teachability is essential for divine work because growth requires correction, redirection, and refinement. Pride resists correction because it feels like a threat to identity. It defends existing positions rather than allowing transformation. Humility, on the other hand, welcomes shaping. It understands that being formed is not an insult, but a gift. God's work often involves reshaping perspectives, priorities, and desires. Without humility, this reshaping is resisted, delayed, or avoided. Pride also seeks ownership over outcomes. It wants to claim success, manage processes, and define results. This desire can subtly shift trust away from God and toward personal effort. When pride is absent, outcomes are released. The heart no longer needs to be seen as the source of progress. God's work is allowed to stand on its own, unclaimed and unadvertised. This release protects the soul from pressure and anxiety because responsibility no longer rests on human shoulders. Humility creates alignment. When pride is present, alignment becomes difficult because the will is divided. One part seeks God, while another seeks self-preservation or validation. This division weakens clarity and slows progress. When pride is absent, the will becomes unified. Desire aligns with obedience. Motivation aligns with trust. In this alignment, God's work flows without internal resistance. Peace increases because there is no inner struggle for control. God's work also requires patience, and pride struggles with waiting. Pride interprets delay as failure or inefficiency. It feels the need to accelerate progress to prove competence or worth. Humility allows waiting without self-judgment. It understands that timing is not a reflection of value. This patience allows God's process to unfold fully rather than being rushed into premature action that lacks depth or stability. When pride is absent, listening becomes possible. Pride speaks more than it listens. It assumes understanding and seeks confirmation rather than instruction. Humility listens deeply. It recognizes that guidance may come in unexpected ways and through unexpected means. God often speaks quietly, requiring attentiveness rather than assertion. A humble heart hears what a proud heart overlooks because it is not busy defending its own perspective. Humility also creates resilience. Pride ties identity to performance and outcomes. When things go well, pride feels affirmed. When things go poorly, pride feels threatened. This instability makes faith fragile. Humility anchors identity beyond circumstance. It allows trust to remain steady whether outcomes are favorable or not. God's work benefits from this resilience because it often involves seasons of apparent failure or loss that later reveal deeper purpose. Pride also invites comparison. It measures progress against others and seeks distinction. Comparison distorts calling and introduces unnecessary pressure. Humility frees the heart from comparison. It allows focus on obedience rather than competition. God's work is unique and specific. It cannot be compared without being misunderstood. When pride is absent, the heart remains focused on alignment rather than rank or recognition. There is also a relational dimension to humility. Pride isolates because it prioritizes self-sufficiency. Humility connects because it acknowledges need. God's work often flows through relationships, cooperation, and shared growth. A proud heart resists dependence on others, limiting the channels through which God may work. A humble heart welcomes partnership without fear of losing significance. Humility protects against disappointment. Pride builds expectations around how God should act. When those expectations are unmet, disillusionment follows. Humility holds hope without demand. It allows God to surprise without offending the heart. This flexibility keeps trust intact even when outcomes differ from anticipation. When pride is absent, worship becomes genuine. It is no longer transactional or conditional. It is offered without expectation of immediate return. This posture honors God not for what He does, but for who He is. In such an atmosphere, God's work is not pressured or manipulated. It unfolds naturally, supported by trust rather than driven by demand. Humility also preserves silence. Pride often needs to explain, justify, or announce. Humility is comfortable with quiet obedience. This silence creates space for God's work to deepen without interference. It allows processes to mature without exposure to scrutiny or premature judgment. Ultimately, God works best when pride is absent because humility reflects truth. It acknowledges human limitation and divine sufficiency. It removes obstacles that pride unknowingly erects. In humility, faith becomes receptive rather than assertive, trusting rather than demanding, open rather than guarded. This posture invites God to work freely, deeply, and fully without resistance, without competition, without the need to prove anything, allowing divine purpose to unfold with clarity, strength, and grace in a heart that has learned to step aside so that God alone may move. Waiting is not inactivity, but spiritual alignment, because waiting, when embraced through faith, is an intentional posture rather than a passive pause. To the natural mind, waiting feels like stagnation, delay, or loss of momentum. It feels like nothing is happening, like progress has been suspended. Yet spiritually, waiting is often the most active position the soul can occupy. It is a deliberate choice to remain aligned with divine timing, rather than forcing movement through personal urgency. Waiting is not the absence of action, it is the discipline of resisting misaligned action. In waiting, the heart is being positioned even when circumstances appear unchanged. Alignment happens internally before it manifests externally. While nothing may shift on the surface, perspective is being adjusted, motives are being refined, and sensitivity is being sharpened. Waiting trains the soul to distinguish between movement that comes from impulse and movement that flows from discernment. It teaches faith to value obedience over speed and trust over visibility. Inactivity implies disengagement, but waiting requires attentiveness. The waiting heart remains alert, receptive, and responsive. It listens more than it speaks and observes more than it reacts. This attentiveness is critical because divine direction is often subtle. When faith rushes, it can miss nuance. Waiting slows the internal pace enough to recognize alignment cues that would otherwise go unnoticed. In this way, waiting is active participation in preparation rather than passive resignation. Waiting also confronts the human need for control. Inactivity allows avoidance, but waiting requires presence. It keeps the heart engaged without allowing it to dominate the process. The struggle of waiting is not about time, it is about surrender. To wait is to admit that not everything depends on immediate action. It is to accept that there are seasons when movement must originate elsewhere. This acceptance does not weaken faith, it strengthens it by rooting confidence in something beyond personal effort. Spiritual alignment during waiting involves recalibration. Desires that are misaligned begin to surface and be corrected. Expectations that are unrealistic are softened. Priorities that were shaped by pressure are reordered. Waiting exposes what the heart is truly anchored to. If impatience dominates, it reveals reliance on outcomes. If peace grows, it reveals reliance on trust. Waiting becomes a mirror, reflecting the true foundation of faith. Waiting also preserves direction. Acting too soon can lead to detours that appear productive, but ultimately delay fulfillment. Alignment ensures that when movement does occur, it moves in the right direction rather than simply forward. Waiting guards against momentum without meaning. It allows purpose to lead rather than pressure. In this way, waiting saves time rather than wasting it. Alignment through waiting also strengthens endurance. Faith that moves only when stimulated by visible change is fragile. Faith that learns to wait becomes resilient. It is not shaken by silence or discouraged by lack of progress. It understands that alignment is more important than immediacy. This endurance becomes essential in longer journeys where progress is gradual and breakthroughs are layered rather than instantaneous. Waiting reshapes the understanding of productivity. In a culture that equates worth with output, waiting feels unproductive. Spiritually, However, productivity is measured by alignment rather than activity. Waiting ensures that when action is taken, it carries effectiveness rather than exhaustion. It prevents burnout by preserving energy for the moment when movement is truly required. Waiting also deepens trust. Trust that is never tested remains theoretical. Waiting places trust under pressure. It asks the heart to believe without reinforcement. It challenges faith to remain steady without reassurance. This pressure does not weaken faith. When embraced, it solidifies it. Trust moves from concept to conviction in the waiting season. Alignment during waiting also involves timing awareness. Waiting teaches the heart to respect timing as sacred rather than negotiable. It reveals that readiness is not only about preparation, but about synchronization. Being prepared too early can be as problematic as being unprepared. Waiting ensures that readiness and opportunity meet together. This synchronization cannot be forced, it must be honored. Waiting also guards against comparison. When movement is delayed, it is tempting to measure progress against others who appear to be advancing. Alignment refocuses attention inward rather than outward. It reinforces that each journey unfolds according to its own rhythm. Waiting silences comparison by anchoring identity in alignment rather than achievement. Waiting is also relational. It strengthens connection by keeping the heart turned toward God rather than toward outcomes. It fosters dialogue without demand. In waiting, communication becomes less transactional and more relational. The heart learns to remain present without needing constant affirmation. This relational depth sustains faith beyond specific outcomes. Waiting can feel like vulnerability because it removes distraction. Without action to occupy the mind, doubts and fears surface. Alignment does not suppress these emotions, it reorients them. Waiting allows faith to address internal resistance, rather than masking it with movement. This internal clarity becomes strength when action finally comes. When waiting is misunderstood as inactivity, it becomes frustrating. When it is recognized as alignment, it becomes purposeful. The soul stops striving to fill the silence and begins to honor it. Waiting becomes a space of cooperation rather than conflict. It aligns the heart with divine rhythm instead of human urgency. Ultimately, waiting is an expression of confidence. It declares that alignment matters more than acceleration and that obedience matters more than appearance. Waiting affirms that movement will come at the right moment and that stillness now is not wasted but intentional. In this posture, faith remains active without forcing, engaged without striving, and aligned without rushing, trusting that what is being prepared in the waiting will move with clarity and strength when the time is right. God's timing is sacred and precise because it is governed by wisdom rather than urgency, and by purpose rather than pressure. Human understanding often treats time as a resource to be managed, spent, or saved, but divine timing operates on alignment rather than efficiency. What appears slow to the human eye is often exact in the divine order. Sacred timing is not accidental, delayed, or reactive. It unfolds with intention, accounting for factors that extend far beyond immediate circumstances, including readiness of the heart, maturity of character, and alignment of unseen elements that must converge for fulfillment to occur. Precision in divine timing means nothing arrives randomly. Every moment carries weight, and every delay holds meaning. What feels late may actually be protected. What seems early may be withheld because it would overwhelm rather than bless. Sacred timing ensures that what arrives does so with sustainability. It is not enough for something to happen. It must happen at the right moment to endure. Precision guards purpose from being wasted on unreadiness. Human impatience often interprets waiting as inefficiency,